Lesson 5.1 Causes of World War I. Several factors contributed to the beginning of World War I. The great countries of the world were caught up in alliances, agreements to support each other in the event of war. These countries, including the United States, had gradually been building up armies for defense and were interested in expanding their global power and influence. On June 28, 1914, Serbian nationalists assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Serbia's ally Russia also joined the conflict. It was a domino effect, and in no time a world war had broken out. The United States initially declared neutrality, but eventually entered the war in 1917. The Lusitania was a fast-moving luxury liner that left New York in May 1950 bound for Liverpool, England. German U-boats had begun to sink enemy ships, and the Lusitania was warned of this. In spite of the threat, nearly 2,000 passengers were on board for the journey. In addition to passengers, the Lusitania carried various supplies and a secret load of munitions for the British war effort. On May 7, 1915, just off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat fired a torpedo into the Lusitania's hull, and within 18 minutes the entire ship sank. The loss of life was huge, and amongst the dead were 123 Americans. The event sparked intense anti-German sentiment among American citizens. Germany did not want the United States to enter World War I on the side of the Allies, but the Germans knew that their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare would anger the United States. The Zimmermann Note instructed Germany's ambassador in Mexico to attempt to form an alliance with Mexico, promising military aid and regaining the territories Mexico lost in the Mexican-American War. The British were able to intercept and decode the telegram and shared its contents with the American press. This, in addition to the sinking of the Lusitania, further fueled American anger against Germany. During World War I, trenches were dug to keep the enemy from advancing. The trenches were a maze of tunnels and false tunnels designed to confuse and trap enemy soldiers. Unfortunately, trench warfare prolonged World War I. For the most part, the Allies and Central Powers were locked in a stalemate, neither side progressing. Living conditions in the trenches were horrendous. Dead bodies rotted, rats, lice, frogs, and other creatures bothered the soldiers, and disease ran rampant. In such unhealthy conditions, soldiers still had to fight. One method of conquering enemy trenches was to go over the top, meaning to run up out of your own trench and across no man's land and into the enemy's trench. Unfortunately, before soldiers could reach the enemy side, they'd often be killed or wounded in no man's land. In spite of raging war, everyday life continued. Artists painted depictions of battles and soldiers. Films were created about the war effort. Women also contributed by entertaining the troops, working as journalists, telephone operators, and nurses. Although the U.S. had initially declared neutrality during the war, Germany's sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann Note, and unrestricted submarine warfare were too much to ignore. On April 17, 1917, President Wilson gave a speech before Congress presenting the reasons why the U.S. should enter the war. President Wilson claimed that the United States would be fighting for democracy and freedom. Congress agreed, and the United States entered World War I. A month after the United States declared war against Germany, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. Commonly called the Draft, this act called for men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for possible military service. Part of the registration process included physical examinations. Those men who were physically able were drafted into the Army. Later, when American forces needed more men, the draft was extended from ages 21 to 45. German U-boats were a huge danger. They threatened trade, needed to keep the United States economy healthy. In order to protect merchant ships from these U-boat attacks, the American government developed the convoy system. Destroyer naval ships accompanied merchant ships as they traveled across the Atlantic. These destroyers kept a lookout for U-boats and, by the fall of 1917, had helped to cut shipping losses in half. World War I saw the introduction of many new weapons, including gas. 1 month after the outbreak of war, the French fired tear gas grenades at German troops. The Germans retaliated with a vengeance, launching attacks of deadly chloroform gas on British troops. Tear gas had been irritating and caused discomfort. The German use of chloroform killed men. To protect themselves against gas warfare, the soldiers were first given cotton pads, which were extremely primitive. Eventually, gas masks were developed, and after 1915, very few men died from poisonous gas. The American Expeditionary Force arrived in Europe and fought alongside soldiers from France, Britain, and other Allied forces. For reasons that are not clear, American soldiers were soon nicknamed doughboys. The term was not derogatory and appeared in U.S. newspapers as well as letters and journals of the soldiers. Alvin York was a pacifist who wrestled with his abhorrence of war and devotion to his country. His patriotism won, and York found himself a soldier in Europe. In October of 1918, York led a group of men on a surprise attack of an encampment of German machine guns. York and his men were able to surprise and imprison 15 to 20 men without a shot. Then one of the prisoners yelled something in German and shots broke out. All but 2 of York's men were killed. To protect himself, York fired off 28 shots and didn't miss once. He was able to take 132 prisoners thanks to his skill with a rifle. World War I was the bloodiest war in history up to that time. 22 million people, more than half civilians, lost their lives. Another 20 million were wounded and 10 million more lost their homes and became refugees. The fighting ceased after a truce was called on November 11, 1918.